are one thing that we're doing. We're working towards other activities like more regional on-the-ground workshops. We're working in the realm of advocacy, which today is probably more important than it has been in a long time, to be a voice for our members. So if there's any way that we can be helping you and help be a voice for you, you just please let us know. And I could go on and on because there's lots to say about our organization, but at this point I'll turn the show back over to Paul and Kate, and if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to be in touch.
Also, oh, you wanted to thank our partner.
That's fine. Yes. These webinar series are made possible through the support of our partner, the Bureau of Land Management. They provide funding for us to make sure that we are able to use this mechanism, this tool, to get the most cutting-edge information to you.
And just a couple more things. Again, we're going to expand our webinar program in 2017. We have at least 6 webinars planned. Part of that is going to be in a series on the National Seed Strategy. We're really excited to start presenting that. And please, everybody, mark your calendars to the Natural Areas Conference 2017 in Fort Collins in October 8 through 10. As Lisa mentioned, we just came off an amazing conference. This one's going to be just as good, if not better. So, and thanks everyone for registering. And now I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
All right.
All right, you have control.
Okay, now I should share my screen.
You should share your screen.
Okay. And that's that. All right.
Beautiful.
Okay, that's one more button to press here. Okay. Okay, hi everybody. I see there's at least 48 screens open, so I'm not sure, there's at least 48 people on, and so I welcome you all. I recognize a few names. Hi to Jan, Miranda, Nancy, John, and everyone else. So I'm Paul Gobster. I'm a research landscape architect for the Northern Research Station. I'm located in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago. We've had a research project in the Chicago area for since 1978, dealing with the social dimensions of urban parks and forests. And today I want to talk about some of the work that we've recently completed, looking at people who live near and visit metropolitan natural areas. So without further ado, so when social scientists and others talk about the human dimensions of natural areas and parks and green space, what we usually mean there are just a kind of a wide spectrum of things, the way people perceive and use and value and experience nature in urban settings. And one of the things that was identified early on about the interactions between people and in nature and urban settings is just the importance of having nature nearby. And that's something that Rachel and Stephen Kaplan showed us early on with their research in the early 1970s. And that work has gone on over the years to kind of catalog and identify the multitude of benefits that accrue from people's interactions with nature in urban settings. More recently, this work has evolved into looking at psychological and physical health outcomes to individuals. There's new work out that is measuring physiological response through cortisol measures, hooking people up and looking at their brain waves, and all of these kind of involuntary measures. And earlier on, we used questionnaires and self-report, and we continue to do that. But now we have real hard data to the point where it's always almost and has become in some places, this notion of having a daily dose of urban nature can really be good for your health. to the point where some doctors are starting to prescribe that in various places. One of the critiques, however, of this work over the years, and especially this is relevant to natural areas people, is that the way social scientists have identified nature has been kind of a generic green space. So the earliest work looked at trees and parks and measurements of how close we are to green areas, public areas. But that didn't necessarily, for urban natural areas folks, tell us about the ecology of those places. But since then, work by people like Richard Fuller in Australia and the folks in Europe and the United States has looked at measures such as species diversity and other things to try to connect those people's response to nature to actual measures. And by and large, that effort has been fairly positive in showing those relationships. An area that I got into probably 20 years now has been looking at people's support for urban natural areas management. And some of this work started with our work looking at people's response to trees and nature, that kind of generic green space. And in the context of natural areas management in 1996 in the Chicago area, there was an effort called Chicago Wilderness that was launched. And very shortly after it was launched, and the restoration movement had been progressing steadily over since the late 70s, but there was a backlash in some areas where restoration was really taking off, and the county forest commissioners put a moratorium on all restoration activity, largely due to some of this backlash over cutting of trees, use of herbicides, and burning and things like that. So we, sitting here studying the people's love for trees and in urban nature, as from a social science perspective, it wasn't entirely a surprise, and we've spent the time trying to understand this and then providing information to managers to try to deal with, how we can to continue to have high support for urban nature and introduce and familiarize people with ecological practices. Some of the work, and I'm sure a lot of you who are into restoration have looked at the literature on what success in ecological restoration means, and the idea of having a successful restoration is frequently expressed in ecological terms, but our perspective is that we also need to talk about the social dimensions. And in fact, when you hit urban areas where people are less familiar with these practices, the social dimensions of the restoration activity can be as important or even more important than the ecological dimensions. And the failure to come to grips with that can threaten your success. And just one more point here on the slide is kind of this a disconnect between what people say about their feelings about restoration and nature, kind of in a broad sense, but when we come down to the actual practices, there can be much less enthusiasm among some groups for how this restoration gets done. And that's what this particular research project that we're have dealt with is going to talk about. Our work was done in the context of a National Science Foundation coupled natural and human systems program, and the main thrust of this work was to look at the differences in the way restoration projects are managed, and that if these management styles had any influence on the ecological outcomes on the ground. So we, in the Chicago area, have three basic types of management styles. There's kind of the top-down projects that are focused by managers who are paid employees, and they do work on projects as part of their daily activities. Chicago has the reputation of being a birthplace of volunteer based restoration management, and that's a very strong tradition in our area. So this is another system that we looked at, this co-management, where volunteers are working hand in hand with managers to make decisions, etc. And then finally, there's kind of a research style that is sometimes used by Arboreta, Botanic Gardens, and other institutions where restoration is approached kind of on an experimental basis without a lot of public input. So the bottom line from that research is that it really doesn't matter what the management style is, that we can have effective restoration ecologically on the ground through a variety of different ways. But and kind of an ancillary question that surfaced when we were doing original planning for this project dealt with kind of the external decision-making process context, and that involves those who live around and recreate around or at these natural areas. And there is this, you know, the reality is that these people also can influence the decision-making process, and they can also be affected by their experiences, and their uses can be affected by what happens on the ground. So we thought this was important to add this component to our work, and that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. Our research setting is focused on upland oak, woodlands and savannas around the metropolitan area. And we looked at 11 different natural area sites. Some were public, some were, they all had public use components, but some were public forest preserves, others were private conservancy areas and institutions. So the major questions for this research are looking at people's perceptions, how they perceive and use these natural areas and their support. And then another component that I'm not going to get into today, but deals with engagement of people who live, who own homes around these places. And that's another important thing that we need to deal with in a lot of urban settings, is that we have these isolated fragments of natural areas frequently surrounded by private land, most of which, at least in the Chicago area, is residential in nature. So it's really important to understand how these people think about, use, and manage their own home landscape. And maybe down the road, we can have a webinar on that. But first, we'll talk about these first two questions. We used a questionnaire, a mailed and a web version that went out to residents who lived within a half mile of these 11 different natural area sites. We also had a kind of a control area, which I won't talk about today, of people who didn't, so we could compare. And then we had some on-site surveys of visitors to these places. So we could get those perceptions. So we looked at these general questions about nature in the city, their perceptions and beliefs about restoration, how they used natural areas and how they supported them. And then we also collected socio-demographic information. This is a little more detail on the sampling methods. I said we looked within a half-mile radius. That was one of the criterions, not only that these were upland oak sites where active restoration was taking place, but they also existed in this kind of residential context. And we chose sites from around the metropolitan region that fulfilled these criteria, and then we did sampling of nearby residents and on-site recreationists.
Paul, can I break in for 1 second?
Oh, sure.
I just wanted people to be aware that they can use their chat function to ask questions. It should be at the bottom of your screen, or maybe at the top of your screen, little box named called chat. Just wanted people to know that.
And I should be able to see those, I guess, too, but so I'm not seeing anything except my head and yours in our slide. So if the chats come up, and I should have a little pause halfway through, and I can ask, we can ask if there's any questions. So here's just a profile of our sample. We had 888 respondents. The nearby resident sample, we had about a 17% response rate. And as you can see, the kind of the characteristics of the sample, it's comparable to the areas around the natural area site. So our sample is not, we didn't have the response rate that we had hoped for, even though we tried like hell to boost it up. We even ended up going door to door, knocking on people's doors and asking them to respond. But we're confident that the sample parallels the actual makeup of the people who live around these places, which tend to be more suburban. We did have one restoration site within the city of Chicago on the south side that had a largely African-American population. But for the most part, we're talking about upper income, white, college-educated folks, a little older than what you might think of the normal population, but within that, of a variety of different people. So let's get into some of the results. And so we'll talk about these various items that came from the questionnaire, and then I'll take a break, and then we can talk about the support in particular and some of the models that we looked at to trying to predict what support is. So we had a question that looked at the perceived benefits of natural areas restoration, and these I think we had 8 or 9 different dimensions here, and you can see there was very strong agreement across most of these measures that restoration, they agreed with the idea that it provided natural beauty, helped to maintain natural heritage values, biodiversity, etc. The only ones that people were a little less in agreement with were the ones on the bottom that were a little more abstract about, combating the effects of global climate change, and increasing air and improving water quality. But by and large, a fairly high agreement. Another question about people's connectedness with nature, and we asked to use this Venn diagram and asked them to circle the one that reflected how they felt about their connection with nature in their everyday lives. And you can see the distribution here, but people tended to feel at least somewhat connected, if not significantly connected with nature in their everyday lives. Just a number of items here on natural area use patterns. We asked if, how often people visited, and this is either where they're at, if they're an on-site recreationist, or if they're a nearby resident. We had each questionnaire tied specifically to the site name of the site. So how often they visited that area. There's quite a large distribution. This graph down in the lower left, we analyzed the data as a function of the distance of where people lived from their home. So this is only for the nearby resident sample. And here you can see that the closer people are, the more often they visit, which is probably to be expected, but also kind of reaffirming. Natural area activities, we asked people what they did at the natural areas that they were at, or where they lived near. And as you can see there, these ones, this was an open-ended question, and we coded them into like nature-related activities and all recreation activities. And as you can see, the most of the activities were not specifically nature-oriented, but the fact that people are in a natural area using, they might be running or walking their dogs or relaxing, but they're doing it in a natural context. So it's not that they're not paying attention to nature, but it's part of their entire experience, rather than just going there to photograph nature engage in stewardship activities, for example. But those activities did exist as well. And here's a little more detailed question we asked about participation in natural area kind of stewardship-oriented activities, attending nature education programs, picking up litter or cleaning up, and participating in an actual restoration project. And as you can see, you know, about a quarter of our sample did something at least once or possibly a few times, but regular participation was across the board was under 5%. Just I wanted to put this one in specifically for the audience today. This again deals only with the nearby residents, and we didn't use this in our modeling of support because we didn't have the, you know, the full thing from the on-site recreationists as well. But for people who live near the natural areas, we worked with the ecologists on our team and identified 4 different invasive species that were most problematic in the Chicago area to restoration efforts. And they were all shrubs, and included buckthorn, privet, honeysuckle, and barberry. And so on the questionnaire, we had these same photographs, and we asked people if they had these species in their yard. And if they did they plant them, or were they there, or had they come up? If they had them, did they like them? And if they had them, had they tried to remove them? And so you can see the different bar charts here for the various species. And for European buckthorn, most people, or a significant portion of nearby residents, had them in their yard. Most of them, very few, had planted them. Most people didn't like them, and they tried to get rid of them. But for these other species, the differences were quite revealing. Many fewer people had them in their yard, but in fact, of those who did have it, there was a significant proportion who had planted them, they liked them, and they didn't want to get rid of them. So this has implications for management here. Okay, let's take a little break here and see if there's any questions from the folks on the panel or folks in the audience, and then we can get on with the next part. So, hearing or seeing no questions, I can just keep going here, and we could stop again at the end.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
And people, again, the chat is probably down at the bottom, and we'll stop again at the end to take more questions for Paul. Oh, somebody has a question in Q&A, which is another way. And Charles says, I'm curious if you looked at trends of natural area use and values among different demographics.
We have some of that data on a site-by-site basis, and I can mention that a little bit later when we get into support. I personally have not done any looking at trends among different demographic groups, but from the literature, there shows that there are some different preferences that vary by demographic samples, and or even well, and even our study, which I'll get into support, gender came out as a big issue. So maybe I should just keep going on that. And is there another question or not? No. No, that's it. Oh, Jim. Oh, results are not surprising given the sample. Yes, that's correct. Okay, so let's get on to the support, and these are the different questions that we asked relating to public support for different ecological practices, and then we developed a model to try to predict support and look at how those different, the predictors differed across the different practices. So, okay, so we looked at, again, we worked with the ecologists on our team to identify what the most common practices were for managing these upland oak and savanna restoration projects in the Midwest. And these are the 8 different practices. They included fairly low-key activities like planting native seeds and seedlings, to hand removal of undesired plants and shrubs, chainsaw removal, kind of moving up in level of intensity of larger size plant material, to chainsaw removal of mature trees, which in the past has been kind of a controversial thing around Chicago, and then use of herbicide, controlled burning, excluding deer through fencing, and sharp shooting deer. So these kind of 8 activities, and then we kind of hypothesized that support would vary inversely as a function of the intensity or the level of intervention. So the ones at the top would be, high support, and as we got down the list, we would see lesser support. And by and large, that was confirmed through our analysis, and this just shows a level of support for the different practices. The one that surprised us out of them was, though, however, controlled burning, where there is about an 81% support for controlled burning across all of our respondent samples. And then in terms of looking at trying to predict support, what factors were important for each of these practices, we used some of those variables that I mentioned already in a regression analyses, logistic regression analysis, to try to predict what levels of support were. And so those include kind of those attitudinal benefit measures, frequency of visitation, stewardship, participation, social demographic variables, and kind of the structural variables of a sample, as the different management styles and user types, nearby or on-site recreationists. And so this graphic tries to explain the regressions in kind of a visual way, but the ones that are highlighted in yellow were the ones that tended to be consistent across these 8 different, so we had a regression model for each practice, and then we developed using those independent variables or predictor variables to see which variables help to predict support for those different practices. And across those, we didn't use the first 2 because everyone supported them so highly, there wasn't a lot of variation in the data. So starting kind of with the chainsaw removal and working our way down, we found that this the idea of these beliefs that restoration, that the practice that we were talking about was already being used at the site, was by and large the most important factor across every one of these practices. And the other variable that came out significant across most of the models was gender, where females were significantly less likely to support restoration than males. And then there were variables that dealt that were significant, but only for specific practices, and that included that benefit scale of the 9 different benefits of urban restoration, stewardship participation, income, age, user type, and management style. And rather than going through a bunch of numbers, which I have, if anybody's interested, I could show a slide of that. But what I'd like to do is just talk about these results in the context of what they mean and what their implications are across you know, for different activities. And so just thinking about the variation across these 8 different practices, and that fire, the support for fire, and specifically, it was kind of a surprise to us. And this chart here shows some previous studies that were done in the Chicago area that looked at support for restoration practices over time. Now, these are not strictly comparable because the questions were asked in a little bit different ways and the samples were a little bit differently constructed, but the results, especially for burning, are very encouraging. If you look over time from '96, there was a study done right after the restoration controversy that I talked about earlier broke, where support for fire was only about 45. Craig Miller from Illinois Natural History Survey in Urbana did a study in 2002 and found about a 73% support for controlled burning, and then our study with 81%. So a general increase. The same can be seen here in terms of tree removal, but when you look at like herbicide and deer removal, the available data and the trends over time are pretty flat. So the support is you know, for some things there might be you know, public familiarity for these practices is increasing. One thing that was really has been worked upon to a big extent in the Chicago area has been burn communications and different activities that the groups now use when they go out and do a burn. They talk to the neighbors, they send out materials. There's been numerous, you know, newspaper articles about it over the years, and I think some of that those efforts in building people's knowledge and experience and communicating the benefits of those programs have paid off. Now, I mentioned earlier about some of the differences across our sites, and I think this has important implications that, you know, managers need to recognize that your constituencies might not all be homogeneous, that you may have sites that where some people are much more leery about practices and others, for example, we had one of our study areas was the site was in the middle of a conservation design community up on the North Shore. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Prairie Crossing, and there, you know, people were totally supportive of most activities. So there's a, you know, built-in clientele. People have, you know, kind of bought into this community, the conservation subdivisions, because the prairie was there, and so they knew about it, and so you have that variability. There's been some work mainly by landscape architects. Joe Nassauer, for example, has talked about, you know, that we need to think about when introducing nature into areas that people may not be so familiar with the kinds of practices that you can use design to your advantage to build familiarity through aesthetics and signage that communicates the benefits, and also to implement projects at kind of a pace and scale that that is consistent with the expectations of users. So if you have people who may not be familiar with practices and the site is very close to where people live, you might want to start out small scale, work more intensively over shorter time spans. If your area is remote and not many people visit it, or if it's on the site of a you know, an arboretum where it's being done as part of an experiment, you can probably you have a lot more leeway of what you can do at what scale and pace. Some areas and in some places, example, San Francisco, where I've done some work in looking at their natural areas program, some types of practices are really just hands-off. They can't use fire. They have a very hard time using herbicides on places. So they need to explore alternatives and how to get the work done. And there's been a lot of, effort, and I've talked about in some of my earlier work about boutique restoration, where you have very intensive hand, weeding of places. And most of these places are very small, but you have a big workforce, and you can afford that kind of high intensity human labor that might be more socially acceptable. Another example that I've seen recently is in Prospect Park. They've used goats to do some grazing, and I'm not sure how this is working, but I've seen that they employed them to graze on the invasive species, and hopefully they're not taking out the valued species as well. So those might be some other alternatives, and I'm sure some of you out there have explored different alternatives as well. So looking more specifically at the model, now I mentioned this idea of beliefs as being really important, and originally we had kind of thought of this question, and we used the items from Craig Miller's earlier work, and he had described them as knowledge or awareness of these practices being in place. But when we looked across our 11 sites, we specifically included a couple of practices that were not being instituted at some of the sites. And when we coded the data for kind of this knowledge, so if people knew that that they weren't removing mature trees on, I think there were 3 sites where mature trees were not being removed. If we coded the data as the correct knowledge, their support was much lower than if people incorrectly said that they were removing mature trees. This idea that this led us to rethink the way what we were measuring, and we now are calling this kind of the beliefs. So this idea, and if you look into the literature on social norms and expectations, that that beliefs can have a very kind of subjective component to them. That if people trust, trust the agency who's doing the restoration, or if they use the restoration sites and they might feel very positive about what they see on the ground, that might lead them to then believe that in fact these restoration practices are happening. And that's, we feel, that is the reason why this variable comes out so high. And kind of the take-home message here is that it really is important to think about what your places look like, how you build trust with your constituencies, and also to look and express the positive outcomes of practices. And this again comes from some of the literature, and we do have a paper of this out that just came out in Biological Conservation. You can read about this in more detail, but some of the literature talks about this connection of benefits to positive outcomes. So instead, and I also wrote a paper back about 10 years ago on comparing kind of the language that people used in invasive species, kind of the biological invasions work versus restoration. And that rhetoric about invasive species tends to be very negative oriented, versus restoration tends to be more positive oriented, talking about the outcomes, what you're trying to achieve on the ground. And this might be a way to approach it, instead of going in and talking about, well, we're going to herbicide this area and we have to kill these deer because they're interfering. But what might be a better approach is to talk about first what you're trying to accomplish and what the importance of diversity is, and then how these things help you to achieve that. and to do it in a way that's, you know, honest and 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 um, and expresses, you know, the positive and negative benefits, but shows that this is the best available alternative. And I think if you, as a manager, approach it from that perspective, it could be a better way than if you just talk about the use of herbicides or in kind of isolation. The other variable that was consistent across these practices is gender, and that was across the board except for fire, and we don't exactly know why it wasn't for fire, but one thing that we, you know, again, looking in the context of the literature, when you think about things like herbicide use, and especially herbicide use and killing deer, they tend to have a higher dimensionality or complexity, and some of the literature that's looked at gender as a variable has said that that women as compared to men tend to have a more complex or nuanced environmental value system, that they weigh things like the effect of toxics in the environment, for example, or the ethical aspects of animal rights versus men who might just be thinking about, you know, just the restoration project and the accomplishment of the central goal. There was a paper that came out recently in Restoration Ecology by Nikki Brockhoven and Anne Cliquet about gender and restoration, which I thought was an interesting article, and it was talking about mainly those who engage in restoration as an activity. So they're actually doing restoration projects, but I think that the implications of it go beyond just those who engage to talk about the broader level of the public and other stakeholders as well. And what they said was that, you know, frequently when they talk about environmental concern, they talk about like ideas of risk when it comes to gender and vulnerability of females versus males. And these authors, who I assume are both women, although I suppose that doesn't even matter, but they said, you know, that rhetoric can lead to kind of victimization of women, and that we should instead reframe this conversation to talk about women as agents of change in a much more positive way. And this calls to mind, you know, two people that I have had a lot of contact with over the years. Laurel Ross from the Chicago area, who was a leader in the Chicago wilderness movement for many years, and Lisa Wayne with the San Francisco Natural Areas Program. But also the kind of the critics of restoration. And it's interesting that a lot of the folks that I have had contact with on both sides of this of the issues of restoration over the years have been women. And to think about, you know, what they're saying in the context of these ideas of complexity, of value systems, and just the idea of including a larger share of people in decision-making processes. I think this is something that we can all think about, and to value diversity as a you know, human diversity as well as ecological diversity in the kinds of activities that we engage in. Okay, and then for the other variables, I just want to touch on three. And so stewardship was came up as a significant variable, and I can't remember exactly which practices, but I think, you know, for most of you out there, I think it's a no-brainer that if we can promote people to engage in participation in stewardship activities, planting or weed pulls, sometimes combining these with nature walks and other education activities, that just building familiarity, awareness, and experience can go far to building support for your program. The different management styles that I talked about very early on when I was describing the study, what we found that in areas where prescribed burning, the variable prescribed burning, and also the deer control, that the researcher and manager-led sites had higher support for these measures than the volunteer or co-managed sites. And this, looking kind of in the context of the literature, some of the implications there might be to, and to a large extent at this point in the restoration movement, most volunteers are highly experienced and trained, who are applying herbicides or using controlled burning, and you all know that. But I think the general public may not be as in tune with that. So not only do we need to continue to develop expertise among our volunteer workforces, but we also need to let the broader public know that these aren't just folks off the street, that they have had significant training, and they're being supervised in a large part by people with even higher levels of experience. And then the third one I want to touch on is the benefits variable. We had those benefit scales, and that was significant in a couple of the models. And but it never really came out very strong. And I think one of the things, and again, looking into the literature, I think it's important that that we describe what the benefits are to people in terms of the values that matter to them most, and especially like thinking about nearby residents. And one of the benefit scales that we used was, improves water quality. But in fact, like around the Chicago area, where a lot of the restoration sites are, flooding is a huge problem, because a lot of the restoration areas tend to be in river bottoms with wide floodplains. And perhaps thinking about restoration on this, it has to be true for one, but in fact, a lot of the restoration does help with flood control and absorbing, the soil is much more permeable, etc. So to maybe communicate these more instrumental or personal benefits could be a way to build support. And I think that's my last slide. I did not do this work on my own, and the folks in yellow are the folks who are on my social science, on the social science team for the Restore project, and then the larger group of people were the ecologists. So we had people from multiple institutions, and if you would like to see the paper that I mentioned, the one that just came out in Biological Conservation, you can either get it through my site, and the web address is here, or you can just go into Google and type tree search. I don't know if you've ever been on that, but it's the Forest Service publication list. And one of the great benefits that we have as public employees is that all of our work is done on government time, and it's copyright exempt, so we can distribute our work for free. So all of our papers are easily downloaded. And with that, I'm going to stop, and we've got some time for questions.
Yeah, there were a couple of questions that came up in the middle, and I'll go back to the one that's on chat.
Okay.
From Haley, she wanted to just make sure that you clarified that the belief that restoration practice is already happening means folks are more supportive or less supportive.
No, it's more, much more, and sometimes, and it's like 5 times more supportive than if they felt restoration wasn't that practices was not being used at the site, or if they didn't know whether or not it was being used, or didn't think it was being used. So yeah, that's sorry, I was not clear there.
And you can see the two questions.
Yeah. Okay, and then we go on the assumption when. Well, to some extent, I don't know if it changes their values, but it can help to inform their what they think about restoration practices, and that in turn can help to build people's value system. So I think that's kind of the way that it would go. I'm not sure if that clearly answers it, but so.
And then Miles also had a question.
Oh, okay.
What cases would you be removing mature trees with support from the public?
Okay, now that's, yeah, that was one of the, back to the '96 restoration controversy, that was the one that really hit people in the papers and on some of the sites, that they were taking out, in some cases, you know, fairly large dimension trees. And so that was controversial. In more recent years, Lake County, which is north of Chicago, Lake County, Illinois, they're doing some oak savanna restoration, and they feel that, and they've done studies that show that they need to open up the canopy more in order to encourage regeneration and get, because they have kind of, I've heard it described, not by the Lake County people, but by others, you know, a lot of the oak woodlands around the Chicago area are, one person called them geriatric centers for oaks, that they have these large, old, you know, pre-settlement, but there's nothing happening on the understory, so they need to open up these canopies. And so Lake County has done some pretty aggressive work in that respect, and they, again, going back to this idea of communications, they worked with nearby landowners through communications programs, and they have done, you know, some pretty aggressive removals in some of their forest preserves, and had very little backlash there. So I really think that that is one of the keys, is to, you know, let people know early and often what is happening, and consult with them. And there may be cases where it's not going to be popular, and then you might get, you know, negotiation happening, like maybe we keep some of these trees near the use areas or along the perimeters, and we do other work more intensively that is more remote. So there may be ways to lessen the visual effects. Okay, the proper rhetoric when talking to folks about, oops, yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah, a lot of that work comes from design, from folks in the landscape area. Robert Ryan, who's a professor at University of Massachusetts, and Joan Nassauer, a professor in landscape architecture at the University of Michigan, have each published some pretty good solid research in that area. I've done work in that area as well, and that, like I mentioned before, is available on through the tree search. And what you might do is just look at some of my papers and look at the references within that, and or you can just shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to provide you with a list. Okay, oh, can't see all the questions. Can you please read the question? Oh, sorry. So that last one was about using design to help build public support and where you can find information.
Any more questions? Okay. Fabulous. Just a couple things before people take off. Number one, thanks to Paul so much. This has been a really informative presentation. I think we'd agree. Some really great questions from you guys listening, which we always really appreciate. And I know our speakers really do too, if you guys get engaged. Somebody asked whether this a video recording of this would be available. It absolutely will. I'm going to promise by end of day Monday at the latest, if not before. It will be up on our website, on our webinar page, and on our YouTube site as well. If you have access to that, then those are all places you're going to be able to find the archive of this. It looks like we have maybe one more question, or I think that maybe that's it.
Okay. I do have one more point, and it's a plug for the kinds of work that I and other social science do, and that relates to your journal, Natural Areas Journal, which I've been a subscriber for 20 years, and but the field in itself, and I cannot move my screen. Oh, there it is. Okay, so yesterday I did a quick back of the napkin analysis of social or human dimensions work published in Natural Areas Journal, and then I also included Restoration Ecology. And like I said, I've been subscribing to Natural Areas Journal for a long time, and I've always been, I do like the articles, and they're very practical and good solid information, but the amount of work that is really published about human dimensions tends to be low, and I would love to see that come up. And so if there's anything I can do to help with that, I'm offering, whatever, reviewers or whatever. And I think, when you go back to this idea of restoration success and the importance of the human dimensions or the social aspects, I think it's critical, and it's not just in terms of building the science, but it's really comes down to what happens on the ground and people selling their programs. We do need to get more information out there about communications, establishing volunteer forces, policy issues. There's a whole realm of topics that deal with these kinds of social aspects. So.
Yeah, Paul, thank you. And I think we'll be talking to you. And as a communications professional, I could not agree with you more. So we had one more question. People wanted to know how to get a hold of you. And did these slides include your email address? Or
yeah, it's right up here on the top.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, well, thanks everybody, and carry on. We're entering some challenging times.
Indeed. Thanks everyone, and thanks to Paul. See you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.